We welcome to the Puyallup Church today our speaker, Lincoln Steed. He's the editor of the Liberty magazine, and he has been the editor of the Liberty magazine for the last 11 years. We had a silent joke just now. In talking to him, he said, I'm an Australian. I said, I recognize the accent. And he said, and you're a West Indian. I recognize that accent too. And then I said, yes, I'm from Barbados. And then I said, you know something, if there's one person in this audience that I can speak to about cricket, that's a national sport. It is Lincoln. And so, yes, we have two separate and distinct accents, but we have what we usually say is the Queen's English. We speak the correct English, right? All right. Lincoln is married. His wife is, I hope I got the name correctly, Rosa Delia. They have two children, Kristen 8 and Christopher 12. Lincoln has worked in Australia, the Pacific Press. Now heads the Liberty magazine. From all reports, very genuine individual. And I'm sure that we are going to be blessed today as the Lord uses him to speak to us. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me at your church. This is a great privilege to see the progress that you're making toward a wonderful complex here. And thank you for the introduction. I'm always a little bit scared about introductions. Your elder was trying to get more information out of me, and I didn't want to give him much because you never know how it'll come back at you. At one church in New York City, after I'd given some information, the fellow got up and he says, he is presently married, and I don't know what. I told him that he deduced that it was a temporary assignment. But anyhow, what he said is true. And I edit Liberty magazine, which is my main claim to fame today, and the real reason that I want to share with you today, because I do want to put before you issues that relate to religious liberty. Matt Pierce was the reason that I'm here today. I knew him from before, and when I came to the camp meeting not too many months ago, he lined me up to come here, and of course the weeks have come and gone, and like you, I've done many different things, but as I was sitting here, I was thinking, isn't there a song, What a Difference a Day Makes? But I could say what a difference a week makes. Because here this week, I'm in your church, and I see the construction and the big plans, and I'm impressed by what you've got in mind and what you're going to do for the Lord. But just 1 week ago, I was half a world away in the direction of where Matt's going, but on a different quadrant. I was actually on the way back from East Timor, which is almost in Australia, and that's a story I might tell this afternoon, and I hope you stay by for that. But on the way back from East Timor last Sabbath, Dr. John Gratz, the director of the Religious Liberty Department for the General Conference, and I stopped in Jakarta, Indonesia. Interesting city. I don't know how many people are there, but it's something like about 20 million people, a huge city. It's all excited at the moment because they've just erected a statue of President Obama when he was about 12 years old, because that's the era that he was in Indonesia, and they're gearing up for his visit in a few days. But what was important for us is that we were there for religious liberty, and the Indonesian Union had put together a big religious liberty rally on the Sabbath in a building about 4 times the size of this gym, and in an overwhelmingly Muslim environment. About 95% of more than 200 million people there are Muslims, but in that context, several hundred, I didn't count, there might have been a couple of thousand people had gathered, mostly Christians, to celebrate religious freedom. And for them, it means something, because by law they are restricted in many and myriad ways. After we had this wonderful meeting, after we had a wonderful potluck, probably like the one we'll have today, and as the day drifted on, I thought they would take us back to our hotel. And they said, no, we want to take you somewhere. And we drove through the city traffic there, and I commute about 75 miles each way from Hagerstown to the General Conference to work on Liberty magazine, and it's tedious. It takes me about an hour and a half to 2 hours each way. But I would hate to do that sort of drive in Indonesia or in Jakarta, because the traffic barely moves, but as it barely moves, it's just a constant fight between thousands of motorcyclists and honking trucks and vans and all sorts of impediments to travel. And it took us a long time to go from the union headquarters, where the big meeting room was, out to still within the city limits, but a more distant suburb. And it was getting dark when we got there. It was, the gloom was starting to settle as we wended our way through a very complicated labyrinth of roads to where in front of us we saw there was a huge church structure, not finished. And it was a bit like this. It had a school built into it. It had a gymnasium built in that I found out were already meeting in. They had huge plans. It was largely out of concrete, and it was about 4 or 5 stories tall, with just a labyrinth of buildings there that was all going to be tiled and some of it marbled, and they showed us where the balconies were going to be and this and that and the other. And the many members there in the gloom gathered around. Everybody wanted to shake our hands. They formed up and gave gifts of flowers and exchanges of greetings and so on. The union president was there. Of course, I was with Dr. John Gratz. It was a wonderful ceremony. Then they went around the circle, and each dignitary or visiting guest had to contribute to the service. They made me give a devotional. And I told them about, now I've forgotten the name of the fellow, not Hezekiah, building up the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah. I got Hezekiah stuck in my mind. About Nehemiah. I hope that it inspired them. The union president prayed a prayer dedicating this new church and its imminent completion to the Lord. You know, it's inspiring to see a vision that people have. And I already knew part of their story. And I heard more of it that evening as we visited well toward midnight in the home of a wealthy Seventh Adventist millionaire, maybe even a billionaire there, who had helped establish that church. They're right in the middle of a Muslim neighborhood. And they have problems like we have in the United States, building a church in a new area, particularly in a neighborhood that doesn't share the belief values of the particular church that's being planted there. In a Muslim neighborhood, to build a Christian church, it was unheard of. They somehow made the transaction on the land, but then they ran into problems to build there. And this wealthy Adventist, who knew a lot of the key people in the country, he was able to get their building permit. But as he was getting the building permit, the neighbors came surging around, some of the community leaders, and they saw him there, not knowing who he was, it seems. And one of them said that he would kill him and kill his wife. Very particular charge. There were actual physical threats against the people for building such a building. And you've got to admire, again, people that are just determined to go ahead and to make that witness and to have that presence among a community that is speaking vile and violent things against them. By the way, I understand that the Union Religious Liberty Director was here not too long ago, and I was emailing him this morning. Greg Hamilton and I are good friends. Of course, he's one of the Union PAL directors. There's 9 of them that we work with. And we were emailing about Islam. And early on, after 9/11, so he and some of the others didn't quite see it the way I saw it. My father had many dealings with Islam. And I think our church still doesn't see Islam for what it is. I read things in the review that are well-intentioned but incredibly naive. Because you know, in Islam, the Quran and the Hadiths, which are their equivalent to the Gospels and the writings of the Prophet and his followers, are quite explicit that it is the duty of all who follow Islam to fight against the unbeliever, by force to push them back and by force to convert them. And so in a Muslim country like Indonesia, if you hold a different view and if you dare to project it against the community, you run the very real risk that their very beliefs will be kicked into motion to oppose you, and that they will, as the Bible says, believe that they are doing the very will of God to kill you. That's the sort of opposition that is very difficult for a Christian to work against, but yet we must. And as I stand here before you, after experiencing that and seeing a little bit for myself what it is to be a Christian in another country, and to see a similar vision that you have to just the same, move ahead and build a church, and more importantly, then practice and worship within that church what our faith holds. As I stand before you, I'm absolutely convinced that religious liberty is central to what we hold. It's not just something that our church does. There are some things that we do that, all of them have a connection to our overall beliefs. The Sabbath school department organizes our Sabbath school structure and our lessons and so on, and the family life and all these. Of course, they all derive from it. But religious liberty is not just something that derives from what we believe. It is integral to Seventh-day Adventist view of what we're called to do. And I can sense myself getting wound up on this, but I've been gotten at for years now by the 1888 people in our church, and I hope there's none here per se. If you are, God bless you. But they have a certain myopic vision on 1888. But while I once dismissed it, since I've been editing Liberty magazine, I've made it my business to read what happened in 1888, to read the messages that A.T. Jones gave, to read the history that lay behind it. And there's no mystery in it to me. A.T. Jones and his co-editor, J.H. Wagner, had been fighting against an imminent Sunday law in this country. Not a blue law, a Sunday law, that for a particular, for a religious reason, the legislators that brought the law in wanted the entire nation to recognize as a Christian nation the obligation to worship on Sunday. That's the Sunday law. What we believe will happen at some point, Revelation speaks about it, and as it came up there in the 1880s, A.T. Jones and J.H. Wagner were convinced that prophecy was fulfilling before their eyes, and so therefore, as a simple deduction from that, it was necessary that the church come alive, rededicate itself to God, because the only reason for proclaiming religious liberty is to enable the proclamation that we are always called to give, to say, fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment has come. And I think the revival, proclamation, the Adventist distinctive is joined at the hip with religious liberty. And to turn it the other way, if we neglect religious liberty, then we are neglecting our calling. As I was sitting down the front here, I was looking for a quote to read you from last day events, and I've made a resolution since September 11, the September 11, that I would always share something from this compilation that was put together at the time of the First Gulf War by the White Estate, obviously recognizing that we're moving through fast fulfilling events. And there's a quote that they have on page 42 from letter 97 in 1886, right in this time period, building up to 1888. That was the culmination of events for a couple of years in 1888. But in 1886, she said, "May the Lord give no rest, day or night, to those who are now careless and indolent in the cause and work of God. The end is near. This is that which Jesus would have us keep ever before us, the shortness of time." You think it's short? I haven't heard anybody speak other than myself and John Gratz last week, and then the week before we were in another location that I'll talk about this afternoon perhaps. But I can tell you, before the Haiti earthquake, before the earthquake in South Africa, in South America, and the tsunami, I've heard Seventh-day Adventists say, God may come in 100 years. He may not come in our lifetime. Well, it's not given to us to know when God will come. Ellen White herself said a no-time prophecy after 1804. But she also said, and repeated, as Jesus said, you surely can see the times and the seasons. Remember, Jesus upbraided the Pharisees for not recognizing the events about them that were in parallel or just as plain as the change of the seasons. And who today would say that the world is going on as it always has? And yet there's some blind people that are naive enough to say that. But you and I are not. And if we believe that things are hastening toward a great conflict, surely we should become serious about our religious liberty proclamation to protect what we have. And we have something very special in the United States, not unique. I should tell you, since I'm banned as an Australian, it's just as free in Australia, it's just as free in Canada, it's just as free as in England, but the United States has a special historic role. More than any Western country, this country was founded or formed, not founded, but formed by different groups escaping different forms of persecution and many times religious persecution. And it has more prominently than any country put religious freedom and the separation of church and state at the center of its civil construct. And we know that when this country turns its back on this enlightened view, it will essentially be over for the entire world of Christendom, as Ellen White often says. Surely we should protect this, and surely we should proclaim it in a special way. I've thought about what it is to be a Seventh-day Adventist and how we fulfill this mission. And it's resonated with me in ways that relate to my own childhood. You know, I'm a fourth-generation Seventh-day Adventist. And probably more important than how many generations, I'm a child of the church because my father was already at the division office in Australia when I was growing up, and then when I was just midway through my teens, he went to the General Conference. So I've always had I don't know if it's the privilege, but it's always been my lot to sort of sit around while my father and the other leaders were talking about what was going on. And I got to talk to some of the theologians. I got to talk to some of the leaders of yesteryear that I can hardly even remember now, but they were great at the time. I can remember HMS Richard Sr. And admired him and others like him. And I remember hearing many, many times certain phraseology, like we must not go back to Egypt, that we must not go back to Babylon. You know, there was a great reform movement or a reform impetus in Adventism, a sense that we needed to keep ourselves separate from the world. And I don't hear that much anymore. I think something's changed in the nature of Adventism. We more and more want to be acceptable, not to necessarily to compromise. Nobody in their right mind will openly say, I want to compromise. But all of us in many, many subtle ways are quite content to define ourselves in a generic Christian way that will minimize conflicts or even embarrassment with other religious groups, and even some of our discussions with religious groups, if we're not careful. I've heard some of them, and I read some of them even in our magazines. They're all predicated on us reaching a certain commonality with other groups so that we're all acceptable and fine with each other, no conflict. That's not what religious liberty is about. Neither from an Adventist perspective nor from a theoretical. What it should be is that I accept the right of a religion that I find offensive to exist, will grant it the right to practice and exist in my community, and if necessary, I would die to defend their right to believe what I find objectionable. It is not to define myself and my beliefs in a non-objectionable way to someone else. We really need to get this thing straight, because there is an inherent conflict in our beliefs with the world around us, and there are many times inherent conflicts in some of the other belief systems and the world that is around them. You know, I'm saying that because you know that 9/11 revealed that elements of Islam are on a collision course with the Western liberal context. And you can't explain that away by saying that all most Muslims are people of peace. Most Adventists are people of nominal belief. But that doesn't take away the fact that at its root, Adventism is revolutionary. So here, there's a very different thing with Islam. It has a root, I believe, of violence within it. But in the discussions we had in Indonesia and some that we have in this country, we tell Muslims that we will defend their right to exist. We won't defend their right to act illegally. That's a whole different story. But we need to have this broad-based view. But back to this vision or this imagery that I remember, back to Babylon, out of Egypt. They're valid images, but I want to turn one of them on its head a little bit. I've been thinking a lot lately about Moses and the Exodus. In fact, again, I was studying up a little bit on my sermon because I left my right Bible at home, come back so quickly, and in fact, I'm still jet-lagged from the trip down to East Timor, and I took the wrong Bible, and so I wanted to make sure I had the markings in it to talk about this. And I even went back a little bit further than what I intended. It's been a while since I've read, and maybe a while since you read, the very end of Genesis. Genesis is the beginning, the positive book of the Bible in some ways, and yet the very last chapter of Genesis is quite interesting. There are two horrible deaths at the very end. Israel dies, and he's embalmed in the nature of the Egyptians. Very interesting. Then Joseph dies and is embalmed in the nature of the Egyptians. Although as Joseph dies, he says something very interesting. In verse 24 of the last chapter of Genesis, chapter 50, it says, and Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. There's the promise. But you go to Exodus, and this is where I want to pick up a little narrative with you in the minutes left. I'll try, not too many minutes left. Moses was born into captivity, like we are all born into a bad situation. Read Liberty magazine, and you might discover that things are not as great as you think. If you go to some of these political gatherings where they self-congratulate themselves on this wonderful country, you might think differently. If you belong to certain factions there, you might think or imagine this is a Christian nation. God wouldn't own such a nation. Think about it. Whether it's Hollywood or Las Vegas or whatever, it would be an insult to God for us to say this is his nation. But it could be a place that is revitalized by a growing group of Christians. That's a whole different thing. It could be a whole different thing. Moses was born in Egypt. There was the promise, and he was to be the promised one. I mean, we can see from the narrative, we're sort of in the omniscient observer's point of view, so we know what's happening. I don't think that was so obvious at the time. And Moses, through an incredible chain of circumstances, is actually in the Pharaoh's palace. He believes, I guess it was passed down from all those hundreds of years, that they will be delivered, that God will show his power. And then when he comes to that great moment when he sees a great abuse against God's people, he's convicted that something needs to be done, he's full of self-centered indignation. What does he do? We don't know if he had a sword, but it was some weapon if it wasn't just his own martial arts skills, because we know that he was a leader of the army. He kills somebody. And again, I'll make an analogy to Islam. Jihad. We are not called, as Moses did, and as some even in our age are called to do, we are not called to violently advance the kingdom of God. Moses made a big mistake, and he paid for it, fled for his life. And I want to pick up the story 40 years after. I don't know about you, there's many people here that aren't 40. I'm a bit older than 40, I can tell you. I can think back 40 years. And in 40 years, it's the mists of time are intervening in my memory of what happened 40 years. And I'm sure I'm not the same person was 40 years ago. And Moses had 40 years there in the wilderness as the sheep herder son-in-law of Jethro the priest, to think and muse on what life was all about. And in the middle of that moment, as he's following the sheep around, who knows what he was thinking about by then? 80 years old. The fire of human initiative was probably getting a little bit low in him. And in chapter 3 it says, he was tending his flock, and in verse 2, the angel of the Lord, we know from other parallel statements, and Ellen White endorses it for us, this was Jesus. This is the angel of the covenant. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the fire was not consumed. Then Moses said, we have to believe in internal discussion, unless he'd been in the desert so long he talked aloud, then we worry a bit more. I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. He was just curious. And our society is curious. And I believe even us as Seventh Adventists, are you just curious about whether God will reveal himself in our day? Or are you under a compulsion? Do you see, as Elijah saw very clearly, as he was in the desert there and observed the state of Israel, of the world of his day, and its wickedness, can you see, as Elijah saw, that God must act because the times demanded it? Moses didn't quite see that. All he saw was a curiosity. And God said, take off your shoes because you're standing on holy ground. And in fact, he said, stand back. And that's a theme that I want to bring up there. He was immediately cautioned. And God said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry. I think about this a lot. I've traveled quite a bit, and some from your church are going to travel to Fiji, where it's not too bad, I must tell you in advance. If they get some time off, there'll be wonderful swimming at the beach. And yet there's trouble in paradise. An Adventist led a coup against the government not too many years ago, kidnapped the Prime Minister. Did you know that? So there's interesting times. But surely, God says, I have heard their cry and seen their oppression. And I've thought about this, as I say, after some of my travels. I remember going to India years ago. Admittedly, India's improved a little, but I doubt out of sight from what I first saw. And it was years, in fact, maybe not to this day, and until I could get my mind in gear to think of a human being the same way. When you see untold millions of people, just a churning mass of desperation, and living and dying on the streets, and smell the putrefaction of a country, not just a neighborhood. How can you rest easy? And when you travel around as we do now by charter, but if you can do it through the newspaper and the internet and see the compulsion of certain people, the systems that they live under. 70% of the world, according to the Pew Forum, live under severe restrictions on religious freedom. 70% of the population of the world. But the Pew Forum made an interesting comment. Many in those countries don't realize it. If 95% of a country is a certain religion and they're persecuting the other 5% so that their very life is at threat every day, the 95% feel just good about it. But God said that he had seen it. And he was reminding Moses, who had gotten used to just a desert experience and, in a blank mental landscape, that something's happening back in Egypt, and I am worried about it. And now he's going to involve Moses. God says, I've seen it, and I want you to go there. I will send you to Pharaoh. There's a wonderful song that we still sing now and then, but I heard it a lot more when I was young. So send I you, said Jesus. As the Father has sent me, so send I you. And it's great that you've got a mission team going down to Fiji. We still do it, but I know the tenor of it has changed since I was a young fellow. I remember the missionaries from Australia going to the mission field. I remember the stories that they used to tell. I remember some of their converts coming at camp meeting time. I remember Pastor Paul Piari, who I think died recently. He was younger when I saw him, getting up at camp meeting with his lap and waving the weaponry around that he and his village had used in his cannibal days. And he told us of them eating their enemies after forays into another village. That's in living memory, that sort of stuff's happened. And when missionaries went into those places, it was to do and to dare for God. It wasn't just, another assignment. It was a calling. And in fact, back then, once they went, they were never to come home to the homeland. I don't know if it was the same in North America. In Australia, no. The only way they could ever come back was if there was some horrible illness in the family or their children's education was so compromised they would request permanent return. Otherwise, they would not come back. And Paul and God said to Moses, I will send you to Pharaoh. And Moses says, who am I? Who am I that I can do this? And it's interesting to me to look at Moses' story. He clearly was well educated. He clearly had been given all the advantages of a high culture, just like you and I. We live in a country that's got education and means and abilities and privileges that are given to us that hardly, even in this day around the world, are given to other people. We are privileged. We are capable. But we're always saying, who are we? Why do we think that we can turn back an evil tide? Why do we think that we can charge out against repression, both in this country and in other countries? As Ellen White says, well, repeating the Bible, a little folding of the hands, a little slumber. And Ellen White says, I don't have it in front of me, but she says, many think that since the Sunday law will come and these things are predicted, it's inevitable. And she says, they fold their hands and sit back, presuming that God will shelter us in the time of trouble. And she says, He will not protect those who do nothing to hold back these things. In fact, she goes further. She says that if there is one sin that God holds out above all others, I heard about the Vatican the other day, more troubles, even the Pope's brother is implicated in it now. That's pretty bad. But Ellen White says that there's one sin among all others. It is to do nothing in a time of crisis. That strikes pretty close to all of us. And God said to Moses, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign. Now, we all want a sign. Paul said that the Greeks demand a sign. Didn't he say the Greeks demand a sign? We want to see some proof. And God says, I'll give you proof. This is the sign that I'm with you. When you come back, you will worship at this holy mountain. Now, that's the sort of sign you have to go in faith on, because it's not obvious till it's all accomplished. But God promised him that he would come back in victory. And he says, you'll tell the king of Egypt, let them go, go 3 days into the wilderness. And once upon a time I wondered, why 3 days? Were they being sort of disingenuous with the Pharaoh? But if you think about it, they were not. It's been a rule of thumb, and much more so in severe desert areas, that you can't survive more than 3 days without food and water in the desert. That was the period of time you'll die out there. So when they told Pharaoh they were going out 3 days, he pretty much knew that was beyond his control. They were essentially leaving. And God said, you'll tell him this, that you have to go worship. But he said, I'm sure that he will not let you go. And, think about this. God's told us to make a proclamation in this country, in the whole world, but you and I are here, to talk freedom, liberty. That's what Jesus gave in Nazareth, the proclamation of a release to the captives, religious freedom. And yet we know from Revelation 13, we know from Ellen White and Great Controversy, that ultimately it will fail. But yet we are to give the proclamation, because even though it fails in the grand sense, it succeeds in the particular. And that just as when Israel went out of Egypt and took that great mixed multitude with them, we have the ability to draw, not to us, but with us toward Christ, a great multitude. And I still think Adventists imagine it's us. when anybody with half a mind should know that already we've shown that many, as it's predicted, will drift through cracks, that it'll be just a remnant of a remnant. But we need to gather the people with us. And so the charge is this. And God says, I know he won't let you go. Not even by a strong arm. And there's a little play there because God says, I will stretch out my hand and will do this. He will let you go. And that theme was mentioned again. I want to pick up on a theme that I alluded to earlier. There's an interesting double incident that follows from the invitation that God gave her, and he stepped back. The ground you're on is holy ground. Moses finally decided that he could resist God. God provided him Aaron as his mouthpiece. It's a great irony of the Old Testament. I don't hardly see Aaron speaking of this. And Moses found his voice again, but there was a human support for him. Moses said goodbye to his father-in-law, who was quite cognizant of his calling, and he went with his wife and family. And that's where H.M.S. Richards comes into the story. I remember very clearly H.M.S. Richards preaching a whole sermon on this text that you can find in verse 24 of chapter 4 of Exodus. And H.M.S. Richards called his sermon, The Man God Tried to Kill. You heard that sermon, some of you? Interesting sermon. That's what got my attention. Who did God try to kill? Because it says in verse 24, and it came to pass on the way back to Egypt, at the encampment, that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Why did God try to kill Moses? Moses actually knew the minute his life started to slip away, and he rose up and had his wife circumcise his son. And I'm not really sure we're called to do that. That sounds sort of physically extreme in this time. But what was going on here is Moses was doing God's will, and he had not brought his own life into harmony with what God required of him. And that thing is true today. And back again to A.T. Jones and J.H. Wagner. That connection with religious liberty is always there. Revival and reformation has to accomplish proclamation. For us to talk about religious freedom when we don't know spirituality and religion itself is silliness. We had a religious liberty conference in the Dominican Republic a few months ago. You know, this is the other half of the island that Haiti occupies. So it was very close to where the earthquake turned out to be. And we had people from all over Central America and the Caribbean and Latin America, most of them non-Adventists. And I said something to shock them, but I meant it. It wasn't just a shocking statement. I got up and I said at a religious liberty conference, I said, there is way too much religion in this world, far too much religion. Not enough spirituality, because religion without spirituality is pernicious. I studied history, and I could write a thesis on the danger of religion in the world. It's one of the most evil forces that was ever let loose on the world. Without spirituality. With spirituality, it's obviously God's method of changing the world, of recreating his image in people's minds and hearts. But Moses was answering God. He was doing what he was told to do, but he wasn't thinking the way about God that God was asking of him. And not till he made that move. And as his wife said, man of blood to me now. Not then was he ready. And he understood it, because if you read a little further in verse 3 of chapter 5, when Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh and said what God had told them to say, let my people go. We need to go into the wilderness 3 days and worship them. What did they say? Pharaoh, of course, was agreeable. Do it here, don't go there. And they said, no, we must do that. And I'll read it to you exactly, so in case you think I'm paraphrasing it, they say, we have to go and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Last year was the year of evangelism, and I went to a number of workers' meetings, and I thought a lot about it. I had to. It's religious liberty, and as I told you with A.T. Jones and Wagner, I can see that they go together. You can't have a proclamation of religious liberty without a revival. And as the year of evangelism came and developed at the workers' meetings, all I heard was numbers setting. In one place, they actually asked the pastors, write down how many people you're going to baptize this year. And, I can hardly, they were doing it with good intention, but I can hardly think of a more dangerous thing to put in front of God. Remember when David tried to number Israel? It was the worst punishment God ever brought upon them. God doesn't work that way. It's not given to us to know the result, but we're absolutely required to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. We're absolutely, we should be under obligation or compulsion to tell our story. And again, I've thought a lot about evangelism. And at the moment, our church is going through another paroxysm of false views by adopting another model of evangelism from outside. And we haven't looked at the Bible, and it's always this man, I don't know what, who was it, the lame man or the blind man? He says, I don't know what you're saying, but he says, all I know, once I was blind, but now I see. And when you tell somebody that, they have no answer for it. It changes people's lives. Changes people's lives. And at the end of this whole exercise, God did stretch out his arm, it says, a powerful arm. They were released, and they came out, as it says, to the day on the prediction. What God had promised came to pass. And Moses, who had, under his own power, like most of us, I don't have to talk to you, it's me. Most of us have thought that we can do it our own way, and not till we realize that if we do it God's way, and if we do everything that God asks, in other words, be serious about it. Not just in our part-time, not just when we decide to, but get with the game and realize that we're at the end of time. This is the time to put our actions where our profession was. Not till that happens will God be with us. It's not that we're about a false message, not at all. We have the right message, but it's as dry as the hills of Gilboa, as Ellen White once says, without the Spirit of God. And with it, something amazing is going to happen. I can give you some evidence, not now, but this afternoon, if you like, that the United States, which appears free, has already, in principle, in precedent, turned its back on most of the principles that have defined it as a great, free, and spiritually dynamic country. Ellen White says the day will come when it will essentially repudiate all the principles of the Constitution. If you're looking for a constitutional amendment to prove that statement, I don't think it'll ever happen. But if you're looking for a new spirit of oppression, of compulsion for religious views, it's on the horizon. And I just want to encourage you. There's more ways to get with this than just to support Liberty Magazine, but that's a big part of why I'm here today. You should be reading what we're producing on this. It's not the only source of information on it, but if you're not reading Liberty Magazine, I can guarantee you don't know much of anything about religious liberty. And I almost can guarantee, because it's the default setting for well-meaning Seventh-day Adventists, that you're enamored of the growing Christian America movement, because it has a certain innate appeal to someone who is superficially religious. But it's the great delusion that we are warned about. I mean, don't imagine when Ellen White's writing in The Great Controversy about the United States acting as a Revelation 13 compelling power, don't imagine that it's self-consciously evil. It's going to be the most religiously fervent country ever, like Egypt was. Moses wasn't going back to a heathen land. He was going back to the most religious country of the known world. They worshipped everything. Their entire civil and religious life was wrapped up in preparing to meet the gods. And so it is with this country. It's not going to become knowingly secular. I believe the secular movement is acting as a foil to bring back a self-satisfied, rigorous form of religion that it has the spirit but lacks the power, or the form rather, but lacking the power of religion. And I would just encourage you, and I don't want to, I've belabored it already. This is time. if you're ever going to support what we're doing with religious liberty. Send your money and your prayers, and even yourself if you're wanting to volunteer, not just with us, but here in your community, to do something about religious freedom and proclamation. We need the money now. And you know, if it was just a matter of balance books, I could paint you a difficult picture. We're in, after all, what structurally pretty much mimics the Great Depression. But I don't think it's a matter of money. It's a matter of God moving upon our hearts to make a difference now. And you know, I've got to be careful how I say it, but you know, the Haitian earthquake, it's one of many earthquakes in divers places, as the Bible puts it, that we are to expect to see. And it was wonderful that Adventists answered so admirably. First of all, to a $2.5 million offering in January, which was the time of our Liberty offering. Wonderful. Misguided to a point, because almost nothing is accomplished for Adventism by giving money to ADRA. They are forbidden by charter from mentioning anything about our belief system. Did you know that? So you've done a good deed, but you have not advanced Adventist proclamation. $2.5 million. If we got that in a year for liberty, we would be, you know, dancing in the streets. And then that was followed by another $1 million for the earthquake appeal. It shows that we are not devoid of human pity, but it does not prove that we have an Adventist conviction. At the same time that we surely should be showing that we have means to advance liberty, Signs. You know, Signs of the Times, I grew up, that was our powerful missionary journal. We printed 1 million plus of them. It's down to about 120,000 now, much less than Liberty magazine. Did you know that? The church's missionary journal is less than Liberty. You know, I could be happy from the editor of Liberty, but it's a disaster. This is the time that we can make a difference. You know, we're all sort of moaning and groaning under decreased property values and the threat of losing jobs and so on, but the fact remains, corporately, we are far wealthier than we've ever been. The dollar is tottering, but still there. This is the time to give the money. Not when the collapse comes, which could be tomorrow, it could be next year, but it's coming. You would have to be absolutely naive to the way money matters work to know it can be sustained. And Ellen White does warn, and you never know whether she's speaking prophetically or just the possibility, but she says that it may be that the monies and the means we've failed to give to the church in a time of ease and of high value, we will throw the money at the church and it'll be worthless. I've been to a few of those countries. And for that matter, Indonesia is a little bit like that. I changed $5 there the second day. I don't like to change money, so I changed $5 and I got 50,000 rupee. And thankfully it bought a fair bit of ice creams and candy and stuff that I needed at the time. But you know, I remember going to Brazil a few years ago and I changed $60 and I got a stack of money this high of bills. And if you go to Zimbabwe, they seem to be over the hump. It's declining a little bit. It's still in the billions of percent inflation. It basically means that the money's worthless. Those things are predicted for the entire world. This is the time to recognize not that the world is on fire, but that we can be on fire. And to see, we have to use a little faith, see that the burning bush is still with us, that God is still leading us, and we need to realize that, yes, with the right attitude, not with the hail fellow well met, you know, I'll do what I want to do, dear Lord, when I decide to do it. No, because the Ancient of Days is calling from us in a grand and momentous time. We can answer it. We can make a difference. And that why not now? You know, it's not given to us to know if this is the absolute end of all things or the beginning of the end of all things. But it is given to us to know that God is calling and that we are a remnant movement, that everything we've been told appears to be fulfilling, and God expects us to answer. And he says, even though it won't happen with a strong arm, with his arm, united with our willingness, great things can happen. And that's my appeal to you this morning. Thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for our speaker this morning. It fired me up. I'm always glad to see people have the conviction that you're coming and coming soon. There is no doubt in my mind that we will see that in our day if we live a normal lifespan. In fact, I think it could be a lot closer than what any of us here think this morning. More than that, just help us to long for home. Help us not to get so settled here and be comfortable here. There's a better land. There's a better place. And help us to long for that. Help us to have that longing in our heart, and help us to help other folks to see the beauty of the King. For we ask it in Jesus' sweet and holy name. Amen.
Amen.